Dear friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the next edition of Forum 2000 online chat, where we discuss the future of freedom and democracy in these complicated times. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming with us Dr. Yascha Mounk, a political analyst, one of the most recognized experts in the decline of liberal democracy and threats of the rise of populism. He's an associate professor of the practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University, a contributing editor at The Atlantic, senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. His latest book is titled People versus Democracy: Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save it. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Yasha. Welcome to the Forum 2000 Online.
Well, listen, it's my pleasure. I have very fond memories of the actual Forum 2000. So even though the joys of joining you online are not quite the same as the joys of coming to Prague, I look forward to it.
Thank you. As your book says, is our freedom in danger? And is this danger actually becoming more acute due to the current pandemic?
So our freedoms have been in danger for a number of years, as people in your region of the world will unfortunately know all too well. We have seen the rise of authoritarian populists in countries in Central Europe, but also in Western Europe, in North America, in Latin America, in Asia, really all around the world. And they are a danger to our freedoms because they start by attacking the rights of minorities, of the political opposition, of dissenters. Um, in the next step, they undermine the rule of law and the existence of independent institutions in general. And finally, once they control the courts, they control the media, they control electoral commissions, they become a threat to the democratic element of our political system because it can, at that point, no longer be possible to remove a democratically elected leader by democratic means. Now, that's been the background before the coronavirus epidemic hit. What we've seen in the last few months is that many of those same leaders have very rapidly moved to exploit this crisis in order to take on an even firmer grasp on power. We've seen that most clearly in Hungary, where Viktor Orban has indefinitely suspended the parliament, taken on the power to rule by decree, threatened people with throwing them in jail if they spread quote unquote false rumors about things on social media, which might include criticizing the government's response to the pandemic quite feasibly. Um, and so I would say that in some countries, freedom is no longer in danger. I think in Hungary, for now, freedom has been quite effectively extinguished. Now, I am also optimistic in one sense, which is that in some of those countries where populists do not yet have plenipotentiary powers. In some of those countries in which, frankly, they have not yet quite figured out how to govern very well, those countries are paying a very, very high price for their mismanagement. And that's an absolute tragedy. But just from the perspective of liberal democracy, I do think it weakens the position of those populists and it makes it more likely that they will fail to consolidate power. So when you look at Brazil, at the United States, um, I very much wish that those countries would have been able to avoid uh, the tragic price of a government's mismanagement. Um, the one positive wrinkle of that tragic reality is that I do think it is now more likely that those countries will be able to retain and recover their liberties.
You were born in Germany, but since 2017 you are a US citizen and living in the US. Uh, how do you view the developments in the concerning the pandemics in the US and Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic there, and what would be the consequences of this?
Well, so, I grew up in Germany, as you said. I've been living in the United States for 12 years. I'm an American citizen now, as well as a German citizen. And I love this country. I never had much what Germans call Heimweh for Germany. When I hang out with other people who grew up in Germany, And they would tell me that they miss German bread and they miss German trains, they miss German beer. I like all of those things too, but frankly, I was very happy in the United States. I didn't miss those things too much. Um, Now, for the first time in the past dozen years, I do have a sort of sense of acute Heimweh, of longing for Germany. And it's because for all of the mistakes of that government, for all of the ways in which we're not yet sure whether countries like Germany and France have the epidemic under control very well either, there is a unifying government that gives a clear message to its citizens, that is putting into place a rational test and trace regime, and you have a sense that there are people who are coordinating response in a professional manner. We'll see how successful they are, but it's reassuring to know that that's happening. In the United States, we have a president who is abusing press conferences about this disease as campaign rallies, who is inciting civic tensions, which have a potential of breaking out into violence. So he is tweeted, "Liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia," and so on, to show his support with protesters carrying assault rifles into capitals of those states. And most importantly, he has essentially devolved any attempt to manage this crisis to the states, saying that there's not going to be a test and trace regime coordinated at the federal level. And given the restrictions on states, including budgetary restrictions, it's just not realistic to expect individual American states to be able to put that regime into place. And so, while it's not obvious that there's an end in sight in any country, and we may have to remain very vigilant for a long time until we finally have a vaccine, there is a sense of improvement over time. There is a sense of rational political reaction in most countries in the democratic world. There's not in the United States, and that makes being here during this pandemic particularly bitter.
So, what do you think will this mean for Donald Trump's position, particularly vis-a-vis the November elections?
So let me first of all be very clear that I hope deeply that Donald Trump manages to reverse course, to put together a coherent response, and to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. I think that would give him a much better chance of winning re-election, and that's a price that, even though I'm very worried about Donald Trump in other ways, I'm willing to pay if it means we're going to save scores of lives. Now, I don't think that's likely to happen. I think that Donald Trump and his administration is going to continue to have a very haphazard response, which is going to lead to a greater death toll in the United States than in many other democracies around the world, and which, by the way, is going to lead to a longer lasting uh, economic damage in the United States than in many other countries around the world. Because even if you reopen the economy, but people are afraid to go to shops and afraid to go to restaurants and afraid to go to factories and offices, um, that's not going to serve the economy. And so I think most likely people will be very angry at Donald Trump. And while he will retain the support of his hardcore base, it's now more probable, but far from certain, but more probable that Joe Biden will win the election in November, and even that he will win the election in November with a significant majority than it has been at any point in the last 4 years.
Can this have a long-term impact on the US democracy?
Well, it could have a positive long-term impact if it leads us to recognize what Michael Lewis has called the fifth risk, the extent to which um, our bureaucratic institutions, our state institutions have become dysfunctional and we reform them. If it improves our institutions of public health, if it gives us a push to finally pass a sensible form of universal healthcare, if it leads to the completion of the American welfare state along dimensions like sick leave, paternity leave, and other things. Um, but it's also possible that it'll lead to even greater dysfunction, even greater mutual hatred, even greater frustration. So we will see about which of those paths we take. I think a lot of the pronouncements about all the things that are certain to change because they would seem to make sense to change don't adequately take into account the constraints of collective action. Just because it makes sense to change something, just because of a lot of people would like it to change, doesn't mean it's going to change. And that's especially true in a country like the United States, that has more veto powers, more different institutions that have to accede to a change for it to become law than practically any other democracy in the world.
Speaking about other democracies, what do you think will be the major trends to watch for, or the major consequences from the pandemic to the democracies around the world?
Well, so I think it's going to go in two very different directions. I think there will be countries in which authoritarian populists take power thanks to the pandemic. Um, those are mostly countries where democracy was already significantly weakened in any case. So when you think about the Philippines or Hungary or other countries, it was sort of obvious in which direction the journey was going beforehand, but certainly that's going to be accelerated now. Um, I do also hope that there's going to be countries in which it leads to a resurgence of democratic politics. First of all, it's possible that countries like Russia will see real political instability because the shocking mismanagement of a crisis in many dictatorships around the world, including Iran, including Russia, including Venezuela, is going to make people even angrier at those regimes. And it's just possible that that will topple those dictators. I don't think it's likely, but it's a possibility. But the second thing is that sort of the core argument against populists uh, now suddenly looks a lot more legible to ordinary citizens in countries like the United States and Brazil and other places. For the last years, I've been going around the world trying to warn people about populism and saying that ordinary people will eventually pay a very heavy price for their ignoring of independent institutions, their attacks on experts, their lack of attention to a free press. Um, and frankly, it was a hard argument to make because most people looked at me and said, you know what? Though perhaps I don't like the prime minister or the president, my life hasn't gotten worse. I'm doing about as well as I was 3 or 4 years ago, and most other people are as well. So all of those harms you're talking about seem to me to be imaginary. I don't see them. Well, tragically, right now, people compare their lives to what happened 2 or 5 or 10 years ago, and they're hurting. Some of that is not the fault of the populace. Some of that is just a novel pandemic that every government is struggling to deal with. But some of that is that incompetence. Some of that is the lack of trust in expert, is the incapacity of having unifying leadership, is the mistrust of government institutions. And so I think the strongest argument against populism, the extent to which in the long run it will harm everyday citizens in their everyday lives, is becoming a lot more intuitive right now. And that may provide the impetus for a pushback against some of those regimes.
If we look at, as you said, this can go both ways. There can be positive consequences. There can be also negative consequences, as we can see in many places around the world. Um, as a democratic community, what do you think should be the priorities? What should be the practical steps that we should be looking at to make sure that there is not a democratic reversal after the pandemic?
Well, frankly, it's quite straightforward. It's deal with the pandemic as best you can. I mean, at a global level, if the narrative coming out of this crisis is that autocratic countries have dealt with this pandemic very well and democratic countries have failed to deal with that pandemic, that will affect the prestige of democracy for a generation. I mean, a lot of the reason why big parts of the world democratized after 1945 was that democracies won World War II, that we proved capable of rising to a crisis, whereas the supposedly strong, supposedly unified fascist regimes um, uh, prove to be less capable of taking on such a large challenge. Um, this pandemic is not as important as World War II, but it may be the biggest and most synchronous global crisis since World War II. And so our ability as a democratic community to deal with this in a way that saves lives, respects the liberties and the rights of people, and ensures that the economic damage is limited, is we're going to be judged by for a very long time. And so I think, there's a moment for supporting each other and writing letters about the abuses of various governments and trying to shine a spotlight on them. And all of that is important. But the most important thing is simply work as hard as you can to get a response to this pandemic right. Most importantly, because it'll save the lives of many people and avoid a lot of unnecessary suffering. But secondly, because that's the best way right now to ensure that people continue to see the deep relevance and importance of liberal democratic values.
Well, thank you very much, Yasha. This has been tremendously interesting. Thank you for your insights. I hope you are safe and healthy. And I also hope that we'll be able to welcome you back in Prague as soon as the pandemic allows.
Thank you so much. As soon as I arrive in Prague, I demand a nice beer and some pork knuckle.
Thank you. Take care.